This is what is known as online lecturing. If you get involved with online librarianship, you'll find out that communications is wretched stuff. It can really tie you down. Tonight I'm going to emphasize the cataloging aspect of online librarianship, largely because of the fact that I'm convinced that in developing computerized systems, you have to concentrate on the cataloging module, so to speak, first. And this is largely because in order to know what you're going to do with acquisitions, you have to know what is going to happen next, namely in cataloging. And of course, in circulation, you can't build a system without knowing what you're going to get from cataloging. And also the catalog is, as you very well know, the bridge between the library and the users. So that it's necessary to construct the catalog first in the system sense, and then to tie the other modules into it. So I'll start with and concentrate, as I said, on cataloging. Now, the objectives of online cataloging and online librarianship are somewhat different in cooperatives than they can be and are in individual libraries. The two major objectives that the Ohio College Library Center has are, one, making the resources of a region available to the individual users in individual libraries, and two, to reduce the rate of rise of per student costs, or per unit costs, if you will. OCLC no longer concentrates on the first C. It has other than academic libraries joining it in Ohio at the present time. Now, the way we achieve this second reduction in cost is by taking advantage of the economies of scale by only doing cataloging once and then reusing the cataloging data that's in the system. Classical librarianship has demonstrated thoroughly that it can't reduce the rate of rise of per unit costs. We've been struggling to do this really for about 50 years, since I suppose it was probably Donald Coney, who died recently and until his retirement had been the director of libraries at the University of California at Berkeley, wrote some papers in the 1920s on applying the new principles of management and study of management and management planning, as it was then called, to librarianship. And of course, subsequent to the Second World War, when we in libraries began to fail, and have been failing increasingly since the Second World War, which has also seen the development of other kinds of information services, and with the pressure on to try to cut costs, and we just haven't been able to do it. And the reason we haven't been able to do it is that we don't have a productive technology in librarianship the way the rest of the economy has, the way manufacturing and agriculture and the service, the so-called post-industrial society or economy that we now have, particularly the service industries. The computer, however, is a technology of choice for increasing the productivity of staff members. Now, actually, these efforts have been going on for a long time. This isn't a new recognition. The book form catalog of the 19th century, particularly the first half of the 19th century, was a very desirable device, because this enabled the cataloging information to be in many different locations. And as far as libraries were concerned, they could have a series of book form catalogs from various institutions and didn't have to redo the cataloging. If some other institution had done it, they could copy it out of the book form catalog. And as some of you, I'm sure, know, Charles Coffin Jewett, when he was the assistant secretary, I think he was called, at the Smithsonian Institution in the early 1850s, developed a plan for a centralization of the production of book form catalogs, whereby he would have just one record, one cataloging record. Stereotype plates would be filed so that they could be drawn out to produce a catalog for any particular library. the technology just didn't exist to achieve this result, so that his effort failed. But logically, it's very much like what we're doing in the Ohio College Library Center today. And then about that time, or at least in the second half, or third quarter of the 19th century, the card catalog began to come into being for a couple of reasons. Well, fundamentally the same reason, and that was that the collections were growing so rapidly that you couldn't keep up with the catalog by publishing book form catalogs. And moreover, the expense became increasingly increased at a rate that it just had to be stopped. So that card catalogs came into being, which had the wonderful quality of being able to keep up to date, but had the miserable quality of being only one of them. And this, of course, sort of brought to an end. It absolutely cut off the flow of bibliographic information, of cataloging information among libraries. Sometime, I imagine in 1875 or early 1876, the librarian at the University of Rochester, Professor Otis H. Robinson was his name, toured around New England, and each library he went to, he discovered that the cataloger or catalogers were cataloging books, all the same books, and the same books that his catalogers were cataloging at Rochester. And he proposed a cooperative in a talk that he gave to New York State Group in July of 1876 that once again sounds very much like the Ohio College Library Center. In a sense, it was rather unfortunate that this cooperation idea was spreading rapidly in librarianship at that time, so that in October, several months later, when Robinson participated in the meeting at the sesquicentennial in 1876, out of which the ALA grew, he discovered everybody wanted to cooperate, so he gave up his idea in New York State. And of course, you couldn't cooperate on a national level, because in order to cooperate in cataloging in this way, the cataloger really has to have the cataloging information when and where he needs it. And the technology, once again, didn't exist for a large area. Actually, it didn't work too well in a small area either. But I'm sure that we might have moved along a little earlier had Robinson continued to implement his ideas in the last quarter of the 19th century. Well, I mentioned that one of the main motivations that brought ALA into being was this desire for cooperation. And the first committee of ALA that was formed was the Cooperation Committee that did many things. It, for instance, designed a uniform card to go on the wall of reading rooms that said "No spitting on the floor." I'm not quite sure just what it did say, but that was that was its objective. It also, not only have libraries changed, as you could see, but so have people. But the most important gains that were made by the Cooperation Committee was the uniformity of catalog card size, which first was 50 by 125 millimeters and then 75 by 125 millimeters. And this made it possible for libraries to get cheap cards, to get cheap cabinets, because they didn't have to have a cabinet maker come in and build a cabinet for them into which their particular size cards would fit. But what was more important, it made it possible to interchange the cataloging information on those cards from one library to another. And although there were other efforts in this direction, for instance, there was a cataloging and publication program that was active in the early 1880s, and some of you sometime will observe, in particularly the Henry Holt books, a sheet that contains the entries to go on cards. All of the sheet was to be taken out, cut up, and pasted on cards, and you had your cataloging. It didn't work. As you know, it happened again in 1959 and 60, which is often thought of as being the first time, and I suppose the time will come when 1971 and 72 will be referred to as the first time. The not everyone not every librarian felt that cooperation was desirable. Frederick Vinton, for instance, the librarian at Princeton, was against it. He felt, it was his view, that a librarian should catalog every book so that he knew every book that was on the shelf and knew where it was and what was in it. And he had a library that facilitated this. It was a kind of an octagonal circular library with a dais in the middle with a catalog that went around the outside at which you could get at from both sides, and he sat in the middle and he could look down all the stack aisles, and he just presided in the center and controlled everything and knew everything that was there. Well, obviously, you can't do that today in large libraries, and this is one of our major problems. Vinton ran a personalized library. He knew his users, he knew his collection. We don't do that today. We have very unpersonalized institutions, and with these monolithic arrangement of books that don't change no matter who comes in the front door. Whether it's Mrs. Wetmore or I, we never think of people as people, you know. They're always users or patrons or communities or groups and things like that. This has come about as the failure of Vinton's type of librarianship, and the only thing that caused its failure has been growth. There's still one-librarian libraries, and beyond a doubt, or beyond any doubt on my part, they're the best libraries. The catalog cards, however, there began to be suggestions for passing catalog cards around. And in 1877, the suggestion was made at the ALA meeting to Mr. Spofford, then Librarian of Congress, that he make his catalog cards available. And Mr. Spofford said just what anybody would say today, and that was he didn't have the budget for it. And it took about a quarter of a century, as you know, and another librarian, before the budget did become available. But in the meantime, ALA had a card program. The John Crerar Library produced cards. If you're ever in a library today and see cards that have red edges, those are the old John Crerar cards. The Harvard University Library made cards available. The H.W. Wilson Company began to make cards available, and as you know, is a competitor with the Library of Congress today in terms of the number of cards that it sells. However, there was the communication problem was still difficult to beat. You couldn't get the information to the catalogers or the user when and where he needed it. At the present time, for instance, in the Dayton Public Library in Ohio, they do original cataloging on 60% of the titles that come into the library because there isn't cataloging available elsewhere. They also are not operating in the OCLC system, although they will be soon. There is, to show you the difference in what these systems can achieve, the Carnegie Public Library in Pittsburgh is operating in the system, and yesterday or the day before they gave us their statistics for March, and they found 79% of the books that they were cataloging in the system, so that they only had to do original cataloging on 21% instead of 60%. And this, of course, means a drastic change in staffing. They, for instance, dropped off 2 cataloging positions in their department at the end of the first month of using the system, so that these online systems are not designed to produce stability within libraries. In medical libraries, there are 3 medical libraries in Ohio that, 2 rather I should say, that have recently joined the system, and their experience has been that they have to catalog 75% of their material because the information is not available. I don't know what's going to happen. They are now on the system, and I don't know what is happening, but I'm sure it'll change dramatically. And as you know, in academic libraries, an academic library all too often waits. And a book, the best book, the newest book, sits out back for maybe 4, 6, or 8 months, waiting for some cataloging information to become available. It's this situation, and the reason for it, as I say, is that the communications were not swift. And what we have to do is have a technology, as I said, that gets the information to the user when and where he needs it. Now, Let me just say a few words about cataloging as I see it having developed. The principles of cataloging are more or less just that. They are a priori principles that have been based on bibliographic principles, and perhaps are more bibliographic principles than cataloging principles, and they're about a century old. They're essentially the kind of technique that existed in science before experimental science began to come into being in the 16th century. You a priori assume a truth, and then you deduce results from that. And one of the results that we get, or the principal result, is of course a catalog. And the assumption is that anything that's deduced from the principles is ipso facto good. A catalog deduced from these principles is a good thing. Well, as we all know, they kind of stopped being good things with a capital G some time ago. And once again, the problem of growth has brought this into being. It's very difficult to use large catalogs. And many users are not only discouraged, they don't attempt to use large catalogs after having a series of initial failures. Also, the catalog is really designed for the librarian. The librarian uses the cataloging information per se. The user, however, does not use the information that's on the card. It's merely a Wegweiser, a pointer to the information that he wants. But primarily, the design of the principles is for the librarian, not for the user. Now, I get into debates with librarians about this. My point being here that the catalog should be primarily oriented to the user and not to the library staff. Now, how do you do that? You have to, of course, find out how the user uses a catalog. And there have been a variety of studies that have been done on the use of catalogs. This is different from the use of the library, remember. But for instance, what information does a user have when he goes to the catalog? Presumably, if it were the surname and the first three letters of the title and the imprint date all the time, then that's all you'd have to put on the catalog card, right? Not all the business that we do put on. We put on the other so that if you get a book in hand, you can check in the catalog to see whether or not it's a duplicate. You don't have to go to the shelf to look. But the user isn't interested in that particular use of the catalog. So we have to know much more about how our users use catalogs, what the information they have when they go to a catalog. There have been studies, as you know, to see if people remember the binding often enough to make it worthwhile, and it turned out that they don't, and so forth and so on. Although I must say that when I worked in the Harvard College Library in the late 30s, the librarian at that time had previously been in charge of the acquisitions department. And a letter came in one day to him from a lady asking him if Harvard had a book that had a yellow binding and a frontispiece that was a picture of the city of Rome. And he remembered it. Well, this is the kind of thing that one doesn't have in a catalog, right? And apparently you don't really need to have it there. But we do need to know much more about the use of catalogs in order to design the new systems for online librarianship. We certainly need to have, if we're going to make the resources available, we have to have a union catalog that's online, so that when the user uses the catalog, he discovers where the information is located when he uses it. And this is one thing that the Ohio College Library Center has already operational. And more particularly, from the user's point of view, we have to get the information to him when and where he needs it. Now, those of you who went to the Ohio State University Library when you visited Columbus saw a remote catalog access system and circulation control system that does just that. It does get the information to the user when and where he needs it, and it's a terrific system. It's the first breakout from classical librarianship, as far as the user is concerned, that computers have achieved. The way it works is that you pick up a telephone in this building if you wish, and call a number in Columbus, which is 422-3900. I know it because I use it very often, and ask them if they have a book that you want. And you don't have to know very much about that book. For instance, if you are looking for Paul Kaufman's Libraries and Their Users, all you have to know is Kaufman and Libraries. And this will enable them to type, because they just use the first 4 letters of the author's name and the first 5 letters of the first word of the title. And although it's a 2.7 million volume library, 90% of the time, the little catalog that the system makes, the personalized catalog that the system makes, has 10 or fewer entries in it, so it's easy to discover Kaufman. And as I say, this works no matter where you are. I use it largely from my office. I'm sure I use 3 times as many books now as I did before, because I get just as frustrated as anybody else trying to use a large library. And at that time, it was 2.5 miles away, and it destroyed an afternoon or an evening to find out that I couldn't get the book, which happens 50% of the time in using a large library. Now, in a minute, I know I can't get it, that I may be able to get it in the future, or somebody, absconded with it. But it all adds up to me by using a great many more books. And I use the system in another way. As you may have been able to tell, I'm somewhat interested in the history of librarianship and card catalogs. And one night when I arrived home, I had a antiquarian book dealer's catalog from Amsterdam in the mail. And there was a book in it published in Paris on library economy in 1839, which I was sure must have information that I didn't know at that time about early card catalogs. And it was only $6 or $7. So I picked up the phone at home, called the OSU library, asked for this book. They didn't have it. So I ordered it. And when it came, it did have more than I hoped for in it. But you see, I was using it as a book selection technique. You use these systems for a lot more than just getting books. Now, how is this going to work for the user? You're certainly going to have systems that will give not only cataloging information, but also textual information. And the present systems at OSU and OCLC are designed to go in this direction. And how do you achieve that? Well, there are some interesting developments going on at the present time, one of which is the picture phone, which operates on the telephone system. I'm sure you've seen it. It's designed so you can see the other person who's talking with you, but it's been interfaced with computers so that you can input information into the computer, and the computer replies on the screen, which is what happens in the OCLC system and the OSU system that use cathode ray tube terminals. There are, and this is blue sky now, or drawing board, or breadboard, or what you will, but there are also coming into being pocket terminals. Terminals like the pocket calculators that you've seen advertised if you haven't seen them, that'll hold 256 characters. You're not going to get much of a book on it, but you can handle a good bit of bibliographic information, truncated entries on this, so that it'll be possible for an individual to go into the catalog anywhere he is, really, by using the pocket terminal, which won't have a wire on it or on him, so that you can communicate with the system. And then again, and the one that appeals to me most, is a development that exists, that is operational, which is a two-way communication on cable TV. This enables you to communicate from your television set to the controller, the head computer, if you will, in this case, on the cable TV, which then would communicate with a library network, and the answer would come back onto your TV set. And I think this probably is going to be one of the most useful techniques for getting the library and its information into individual homes, offices, and elsewhere. Now, in designing this new online library, I'm convinced that we're going to have to personalize the catalog. I've already spoken about the impersonal aspects of modern librarianship, but those of you who saw the OCLC system know that what happens is that you put in a request to the system. There's nothing in the system that remotely resembles a catalog. I won't go into it in detail to prove it to you, but you'll have to accept that one in the absence of Blackboard. What the system does is it makes a personalized catalog for you that'll vary from 1 to n number of entries, and says if it's in the system, it's in this personal catalog. For instance, if you put in Kaufman, K-A-U-L-I-B, which is in the OCLC system, you get back, I think it's 3 truncated entries, a little catalog of 3, and if you want to get the complete information, you then ask for the number that's the Kaufman book, and it gives you the complete bibliographic information as well as the complete holding information of the institutions that hold the book. This is the kind of thing that we're going to have to do. We're going to have to go further than that too, when we can handle text material and create the kind of divine library in which the material is always on the shelf, so to speak, but you can have any part of it anytime you want. But it'll have to, we'll have to do the classification, the gathering together for individuals on the basis of their request, and this will come. It isn't going to come in the 70s, but I wouldn't be surprised if you saw it in the 80s and surely in the 90s. Now, what about computerizing the cataloging process itself, not just the manipulation of the information in the catalog? This, I think, you will see relatively soon. It's entirely possible. You remember what I told you about OSU? In this library, there's the 14th largest library in the country. 90% of the time, the personalized catalog contains 10 entries. If you're asking for a book by Kilgore, let's say, you don't have to know that the G in my middle name stands for Gridley, that I was born in 1914, and all those exciting things that now get onto catalog cards. In fact, you really don't have to know how to spell my name. Most people spell it K-I-L-G-O-R-E, but that isn't the way I spell it. But in these systems, all you have to know is the K-I-L, and whatever you want to do with the last part, feel free. It cuts down on the amount of error input. If you go looking for me under K-I-L-G-O-R-E in a large library, you're going to miss me by a long way, you know. But in these systems, you don't. So that with this situation, and with these very small catalogs you see that are being prepared, you don't have to have all the information that we had. And we're reasonably sure, and perhaps I should say I'm reasonably sure, that you can simply transpose, I would hope by mechanical means, but it won't happen as soon as I'd like to have it happen, the information on a title page, just the string of information as it occurs on the title page, index it in analogous to the way that we do the indexing now, except to have a stop list, a huge stop list of structure words, and then obtain the information from the system. Let me say, I have done a couple of books. One of them was the medical library it was the library of the medical institution of Yale College, and this would be under Kilgore, Frederick, Medical Institution, Library, and I guess and Yale and College. And if you put 2 or 3, probably 3 of these words together, like K-I-L, L-I-B-Y-A-L, then the system would produce the record for you. It doesn't have to know which word is the author, or which words are in the title, or the imprint, or what you will. So that I think we're very likely to see this kind of development, because we just simply don't have to have all that cataloging information for an online catalog. Now, as you can see from this statement, that we're in for considerable changes. And although Mrs. Wetmore said that we have turned a corner, and we have, and we're off the ground and for about 10 seconds or so, there's a long, long way to go. But it's a very wide vista that's opened up now for really new and novel developments in librarianship. Well, others have been working on the mechanization of subject classification and subject indexing. And they've been using experimental groups of data, largely journal articles and abstracts. And this works, and it works very well with a relatively small amount of human intervention. There's some real problems. We aren't about to use it in Columbus. The programs are horrendously inefficient, and but the time will come when there will be efficient programs, so that a very large part of cataloging will be done mechanically. I would think that maybe 10 or 15 years from now, the libraries might not have cataloging departments. They'll have a catalog specialist who will be handling the cataloging problems that the new technology with which it cannot cope. We have that now, you know. Our present technology doesn't cope with everything that comes into the catalog department, and you do various and sundry things with it. I used to have, when I was at Yale, which was this was in the mid-'60s, and when this kind of thing was going on, I had librarians who would come to visit us and see our computer system, some of whom would have been sent by the presidents of their universities. They didn't really want to come. And they were all set. They had a lot of reasons in advance as to why it wasn't going to work for them. One of them, who was about a dozen years younger than me, twice told me that it was for much younger men than he. And finally I asked him, he said, "How old do you think I am?" You know? Well, it was the first time he looked at me, but he'd had his little piece all rehearsed before he got there. And one librarian, when he discovered that we could only handle titles in Roman alphabet, said to me, this was when I was at the Yale Medical Library, said, "But what do you do when you get a book on internal medicine in Tibetan?" And I said, "We do just what we do with it now." He said, "What's that?" I said, "Nothing. You know, what do you do with a book on that?" They don't exist in the first place, but why would you do anything? So, but we have cataloging specialists at the present time to make that decision to do nothing, you know, or whatever it is that you want to do. We rather delude ourselves into thinking that these manual systems handle 100%, whereas you know full well, if you think about it for about half a minute, they don't. Well, how do we get to this kind of situation in the future from where we are? Many people in librarianship, and I was certainly one of them a dozen years ago, can see how the computer can do this kind of thing, but they, in a general way, but in a specific way of what do I do first? You know, where do I go from where I am in order to get to this this futuristic type of librarianship? It isn't so terribly futuristic, actually. It's some of it is with us, as you know. Well, one route is via an OCLC-like system, or OCLC. The present cataloging online at OCLC and the automatic concurrent construction of the online union catalog is via three accesses. There are three instructions, so to speak, that you can give the computer to get that personalized catalog. The Library of Congress card number. There's the 3 letters from the author, 3 from the first word of the title, and 6 letters from the title. 3 from the first word and 1 from the next and the next 3, or next one if there's only one. We will soon be adding an author index so that you can request a little catalog that contains everything by a single author. We are following the Library of Congress and AACR. We have certainly produced changes in staffs internally in libraries, and there are more to come as the systems develop. However, the present cataloging in the system is perfectly mixable with computerized cataloging directly from the title page. The economy of scale is roughly 70-30. There are 70% of the time, on the average, libraries don't have to do the cataloging. It's in the system. And the cataloging at the terminal is done in the larger libraries by clerks almost entirely, not quite, but almost entirely. And they do 15, 20 titles an hour. Some do more. The size of the system. This morning, there were 595,000 catalog records in the system. Roughly, in academic libraries, the relationship of volumes to titles is 2.7 to 1. So you multiply this, say, 600,000 by 2.7, and I guess you get about 1,600,000, 500,000 volumes. This is what this catalog now represents. There's a problem, though, and that is there are both Library of Congress Mark II records in there, and records produced by the 30%, were produced by the participating libraries. In actual numbers, as of Sunday, on the 1st of April, the OCLC records were 47.3%, and the Library of Congress was the complement. And it goes, the OCLC percentage goes up about 1% a month, so presumably this summer it will exceed the Library of Congress records. And every one of the OCLC records was used originally when it was put in, but only 3/10 of them are used again, 0.36 actually. The Library of Congress, there are 200,000 records in there that have never been used. And we are spinning them at a high rate of speed right now in Columbus, and somehow or other we've got to work out a more efficient technique, maybe the Library of Congress does too, not to produce records that are not used. Because of the 300,000 records, 300 plus, roughly there are 200,000 that have not been used and 100,000 that have been used that are Library of Congress records. But though when a Library of Congress record is used, it's used heavily. They're used a total of 4.06 times compared to the really 0.36 of the OCLC records. But there's this problem of unused proof slips, if you will. It's the same kind of analogous situation. Now for the Union catalog, the online Union catalog on Sunday, it had 927,000 locations recorded in it. It will be 1 million soon. We only began operation. It'll be 1 million 2 years after we began operation, which was in the online operation, which was in the summer of 1971. So that the system is growing fairly rapidly. Growing, as a matter of fact, at over 1,000 records a day, 1,300. Let me tell you briefly what happens at the Ohio University, because it has made a strenuous effort to make a full use, to get full benefit out of the system. There, most of the cataloging is done by clerks. Some records that are in the system are handled by sub-professional people. If there isn't a record in the system, then a professional cataloger does the cataloging. But their activity during the first half of this academic year, I should say July through December of 1972, at the end of December, they had, in fact, early in the year, I guess near the beginning of that half year, they had reduced their cataloging staff by 8 people, but they cataloged during that 6 months at the rate of 47,000 titles a year, whereas before they started to use the system, and with the additional 8 people, they were doing 25,000 titles. This will give you some idea as to the effectiveness of such systems. Now, what about network organization? This is a real toughie. Nobody has really achieved much of anything yet. We have a large network. We've got 4,000 miles of this stuff, telephone line kind of business, circuits. And it's a multiple party, multiple line synchronous transmission net, and it's the largest one the phone company has. And it sure has given us plenty of trouble getting it going. But it works and works well once it gets going. But the major work to be done in terms of the actual design of an operational network, there's a lot yet to be done. Most of what you hear is the kind of blue sky stuff, or business about stars and spider nets and so forth and other astrobiological artifacts, I suppose. But the logical and operational nets there's not much help from the abstract business, and we've got a lot to learn there yet, and I bet it'll be painful learning it. And OCLC is going to start learning it because a week ago Monday, the membership voted to extend the OCLC services outside of Ohio to other regional groups. It had not done this before, and to do it in the basis of constructing a network, not just individual groups disconnected around the countryside. Well, what is the implications of this for students? First of all, I would say that you're going to have to know more about library automation and computers than you think you're going to have to know, or maybe than you want to know. And this is true, I think, of all librarians. For instance, we have, in opening up the OCLC within Ohio to non-academic libraries, a school librarian who's making the decision has to know just as much as a large public librarian or a large university librarian. You're now in library computerization. You're now because of the onlineness of the present systems. So that it isn't any longer the situation that this isn't going to affect me. It's going to affect every library soon. And finally, perhaps not finally, I guess I should say first, what you are going to have to do is you're going to have to learn how to become a librarian, because you're going to spend the rest of your life learning how to become a librarian. This wasn't true when Mrs. Wetmore and I were at Columbia together in the summers of, some time ago. When you got your degree then, and maybe it still happens some places, you sort of got tapped on the shoulder and you were a librarian. You might have some experience that would enable you to do this, that, or the other thing, but in general, you could work in a medical library or a public library. You were really qualified with a capital Q. This was generally true of education. When I graduated from Harvard, along with about 900 other guys, President Lowell admitted me to the Fellowship of Educated Gentlemen. Well, what's that? This had no meaning. It didn't have much meaning then, but it sure doesn't today. But those are the days of the well-rounded college graduate who usually rolled into a ditch pretty soon, and unless he was lucky. You're going to have to do what a physician does. A physician spends his entire life learning how to become a physician. So does an engineer. Most engineers, and certainly electronic engineers. And now with the new developments, new knowledge, not essays, but research papers that have been appearing, and certainly in the last decade, you have to read them, you have to collect them, you have to request the off-prints. And as far as I'm concerned, any off-print is worth a letter. Most people send postcards. And form your own library, your own collection of documents, off-prints, and make what you read part of your armamentarium of knowledge to use in the job. This is one of the major difference that's coming into librarianship. And as I said, this is one thing that I can't emphasize too heavily, that you, when you leave school, you should leave it with the point of view that you're going to be learning the rest of your lives. And although I don't want to denigrate schools, it's often more fun doing it on your own than having somebody else do it to you, But the really exciting thing is learning. If there's any human aspect of a human being, it's the ability to learn in this way, and it's for me, it's the most exciting aspect of librarianship. Well, what about online librarianship? And as far as it's gone in these two systems in Columbus, they do increase the availability of resources. As you can see, we're almost up to 1 million locations in Ohio now in a couple of years, and that doesn't include the million at OSU. And the system does reduce the rate of rise of costs. But I emphasize again, we're just at the beginning, and I hope you get involved soon, because it's really real good fun. Thank you. Now I'm supposed to have stirred up some questions in your mind. And if you, why don't you ask me some, one at a time. Yes?
I'd like to know, do you think the 30% that people aren't finding in your system, are those mostly retrospective titles, or?
Mostly retrospective and foreign. The Library of Congress records are only in English at the present time. Well, I think they're just about beginning with some French. But it's mostly retrospective and foreign. That's correct. Yes?
When you speak of extending OCLC outside the Ohio area, will this be in the form of sort of sub-OCLCs in various regions with people reporting into them, or will people have direct access to OCLC?
Both. We'll do it on the basis of providing the service to a region from a computer in Columbus, or assisting the region to replicate the system so that it has its own computer. However, we'll have to hook up with Columbus in either way so that there's a net that's coming into being. Or it can be both. If a region elects to replicate this system, this isn't the kind of thing you do in a couple of weeks, you know. It's almost impossible to do it in fewer than 18 months. But the other aspect of the system can be gotten going in the region, and you can move more slowly and comfortably in getting your own machine and getting going. So we're prepared to do it in both ways, really three ways. Yes?
If you were to write a job description for an academic library administrator in the year 1980, what would it look like?
I wouldn't write it. I refuse to have any job descriptions in my own shop. It's too dynamic a situation to have job descriptions. It's not really, of course it's somewhat different. There's a lot of research and development, but it's changing rapidly. The job assignments are changing rapidly. The people are changing them themselves. This is true in the libraries that are using the system also. The flow of communication and relationship isn't the traditional hierarchical up and down stuff in my organization. It's almost all lateral, and the jobs are constantly changing, and as they take on more responsibility, they get other titles and more money, and and the same thing is going on in library. Let me give you one example. When we get the technical processing system going, and a person checks in a book that has been ordered and comes into the library by recording the invoice information and so forth, 70% of the time there'll be a flag on that screen that says the cataloging information is there. Makes no sense to send that book to what used to be called the catalog department and have somebody else bring the record up on the screen and do the cataloging. What makes sense is for the cataloging to be done by that person too. So that in the larger libraries, you see, this has the effect of really knocking down the wall between a part of acquisitions, half of it anyway, and the cataloging department, and having a new job description, a new train. You know, I mean, it really is. It's an unstable situation, and I don't think it's amenable or shouldn't be treated with job descriptions. It moves too rapidly. Let me say one thing that's recalled my mind. It's really a statement of Alfred North Whitehead, the philosopher. He once wrote that you should never confuse instability with insecurity. Many people do. But instability is not insecurity. This is really when life is most fun, I think. And as Whitehead pointed out, the great areas of intellectual development in human history were periods of great instability, like the age of Pericles in Greece, let us say, or the 20th century. He didn't refer to the 20th century, he was writing in the very early part of it. But don't feel that you're insecure because you're in an unstable situation. These can often, for me, they're the most fun. You had a question, didn't you?
Yes, I did. What sort of money are you talking about when you're talking about extending your services outside of the OCLC line?
You mean what's it going to cost somebody else?
What's it going to cost Indiana to do this?
In what?
What is it going to cost Indiana to do this?
Oh, I really can't answer that question. But let me say this: that as far as the system is concerned, Indiana can, or the libraries in Indiana, can have the same experience as the libraries in Ohio. such as the one that although OU is a kind of a star, you'll have the reduction in the number of staff and an increase and a corresponding increase in the productivity. Or if the productivity doesn't go up, the staff goes down further. And it isn't just the large libraries for which this is the case. For instance, Western College, that's in Oxford, Ohio, used to be Western College for Women, but you know what happened. It had a full-time cataloger, but because of the system, it reduced. It now has a half-time cataloger. And in that change, it saves $4,200 a year, and the system costs it $2,100 a year. So, it goes from the small to the large. And I would rather answer the question that way than to say, what's it going to cost? Okay?
Do you have graduations for it, depending on how much a library will use it?
Well, at the present time, we have a very unsatisfactory way of charging, from my point of view. We charge on the basis of the use of a record in the system rather than for the use of the system. And our accountants, Haskins and Sells, have recommended to us that we change the pricing to the use of the system rather than the use of a record in the system. Let me give you an extreme example. The use of the record is the use for cataloging, for catalog production. A couple of libraries have these terminals in their reference department where there's no catalog production. So what do we do? Is it free? They're getting no charge for all the uses of the system, you see. Well, actually, we don't allow that, but we do charge them just plain cost at the present time until we take care of this pricing structure. You will hear the cost, what it costs to catalog on the OCLC system. And it's unfortunate that we have this method of pricing because it includes all the other uses. Those accesses, for instance, are used 1.5 times as often. The system is accessed 1.5 times as often for non-cataloging uses as it is for cataloging, but there's no charge for that the way the present pricing is done. I can also assure you that you can misuse the system. Add it just the way you would a Xerox photocopier in the front wall or something. Make no changes. You have to make changes in your procedures. You have a question?
Yeah, I just finished reading Melcher and what he had to say on Mark tapes. And I wonder, are you that impressed from the way you sound that it has a great deal of flaw in the system?
Has a great deal of what?
There's flaws in the system. Do you think you'll ever be able to do without it? Mark tapes, I mean, you're way ahead of them now.
Well, first of all, there aren't flaws in the system. Not any considerable flaws. It really works, as you can see. I mean, I checked yesterday. Yesterday there were 2,681 titles cataloged on the system, and 18,500 catalog cards produced. When you're doing that, it's really working. Yes?
Have you done any cost studies, for instance, on the average cost of a set of cards?
Yeah, well, I can tell you, we don't produce sets of cards, but we produce cards in final form according to the specifications given us by libraries. We won't do everything. We will not print on the back of cards, we won't put call numbers in the upper right-hand corner of cards, and we won't print in red. But aside from that, we do just about everything. 2, 3, 4 spaces for second indentation or whatever you want. If we did produce sets, there are enough options in the system so that we could produce over 6,000 different sets for one title, okay? Now, the present charge that we're charging for cards is 3.5 cents per card, which is considerably cheaper than any library can do it, or considerably cheaper than what you get the raw cards from the Library of Congress for, right? And this 3.5 cents includes the amortization over a 1-year period, which our accountants don't like, of the interface between the Xerox computer that we have and an IBM printer that cost about $16,000. There's also an overhead charge of 3/4 of a cent in there, if I were talking to you like this before 5 o'clock, it would be for paying my salary to do it, you know. So that, and Haskins and Sells has twice looked at this accounting to make sure that everything that is accountable, so to speak, is in the charge, and it is. So that I don't think there are very many libraries, in fact, I never heard of one, that had one of the big 8 or any accountant come in and do cost accounting on card production, you know. The reason we don't, the cards are not included in the membership fee, which is based on the use of records, because, well, particularly in public libraries, a small academic library will get maybe we'll say 6 cards or 5.5 cards per title, whereas a public library may get 30 or 40 cards per title. And the result would be that if you lumped it all together, that the small libraries would be paying for the cards for the large libraries. So we make a separate accounting for the cards. Yes.
You say that you have now some other than academic libraries that would be public libraries.
Yeah, so far. This is just beginning to happen.
Could you give us a description of the size of some of them that you're going to have, or?
Yeah, well, the 3 that we have at the present time, let me see. In terms of titles, they're cataloging about 8, 9, 10,000 titles a year. And about 10 times that number of volumes being added to the collection, which I presume includes journal serials as well as the the multiple copies for single titles. In one institution, I think it was I forgot which one it was. I think it was Dayton though. I calculated that their membership fee for using the system for a year would be $14,000. They're the ones that do 60% of their cataloging originally, and that would drop to 33% so that they would be able to approximately reduce their cataloging staff by half. Well, it doesn't have to be, I don't think they've got 4 people in the catalog department that are doing that 60% of 8 or 9,000 or whatever it was. They certainly have more. So that even if 2 positions were dropped, they still would recover and more the $14,000. And the cards will cost them less this way than the way they're producing them. Yes?
What process must the library go through to become a user of your system?
Well, a library in Ohio, this will depend, of course, on the rules in each region. But in Ohio, it's relatively simple. All you have to do is tell me that you want to become a member and that you want a terminal as soon as you can get it and that kind of thing. And we then get the terminal into the library as soon as we can, and there's delays. And then after they've started cataloging, then we issue them a prorated invoice for the rest of the fiscal year, and then at the end of the year, another invoice for the following year with a credit or debit depending upon whether they did more or less than the original estimate. There's no contract. There's no agreement. I'm not sure that this is the way to do it. But as you can see, for instance, we'll go back to the Ohio University, any library that's dropped off 8, actually they've now dropped off 10. They've dropped off 10 positions and has nearly doubled its cataloging, can't possibly afford to go back to a manual system. They not only have to get those 10 back, but they then have to more than double, because you get a rate of diminishing returns when you add people to large units in cataloging or any other place. So you have to have at least twice as many people to do that catalog. Well, thank you again. If I can get out of my harness.